The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty highway as Marcus Steele Rodriguez guided his Harley around the familiar curves of Route 47. After 23 years with the Hells Angels, these solo rides had become his sanctuary, moments when the weight of his leather vest and the expectations that came with it could fade into the rhythm of the engine. The countryside stretched endlessly before him, peaceful and untouched by the complexities of club life. But as he crested the hill near Miller's Crossing, that peace shattered like glass against concrete. A silver sedan lay crumpled against the guardrail, steam rising from its twisted hood. And there, sprawled on the asphalt 20 feet from the wreckage, was a woman in a torn dress, her dark hair matted with blood. Steele's instincts, honed by decades of street wisdom, screamed danger. But when their eyes met, and she mouthed a single desperate word, help, he knew his quiet Saturday had just become something else entirely. What Steele didn't know was that stopping to help this stranger would uncover a truth that would shake everything he thought he knew about loyalty, justice, and the thin line between right and wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Steele's boots hit the asphalt with deliberate weight as he approached the scene, his Harley's engine still rumbling behind him like a faithful guard dog. 23 years of brotherhood had taught him to read danger in the smallest details, the way glass scattered, how metal bent, where blood pooled. This crash scene whispered wrong in every direction. The woman lay motionless beside the guardrail, her blue dress torn at the shoulder, revealing defensive wounds that made Steele's jaw tighten. Fresh scratches ran down her arms like claw marks, and her left cheek bore the purple bloom of a recent bruise. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, alert, terrified, and very much alive. "Ma'am?" Steele kept his voice low, non-threatening. His size had intimidated plenty of people over the years, and this woman had already been through enough. "Can you hear me?" She blinked slowly, focusing on his face with effort. You're not him." Relief flooded her voice. "Thank God you're not him." "Who's him?" Steele knelt carefully, noting how she flinched at his movement. "What happened here?" Someone forced me off the road." She struggled to sit up, wincing. He said he'd found me." Her hand moved instinctively to her throat, where faint finger marks shadowed her pale skin. Steele's eyes swept the crash scene again, this time with purpose. The skid marks told a story that didn't match her words. Instead of the long, straight tracks of sudden braking, he saw the curved scars of deliberate maneuvering. Someone being pushed, not surprised. "What's your name?" He helped her lean against the guardrail, noting how her wedding ring caught the morning light. The diamond setting was twisted, the band scratched and bent as if someone had grabbed her hand violently. Sarah Chen. She looked up at him with dark eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "I know this looks bad, but please don't call the police." "They won't believe me. They never believe me." That phrase hit Steele like a physical blow. He'd heard those exact words from his mother 28 years ago, when his father's fists had left their own map of bruises across her face. The police had taken a report, filed it away, and told her to call if it happened again. It happened again 2 days later. "Mom, Sarah, you need medical attention." Steele pulled out his cell phone, then hesitated when he saw the panic flood her features. "Please." Her fingers wrapped around his wrist with surprising strength. "He has friends everywhere, connections. If you call 911, he'll know exactly where I am within the hour." Tears tracked through the dirt on her cheeks. "I finally got away from him." "Don't let him find me now." Steele studied her face, seeing truth in every line of fear etched there. Her phone lay cracked beside the wreckage, its screen spiderwebbed but still functional. A partial text message glowed through the damage. "You can't hide forever, Sarah." The distant rumble of an approaching engine made them both freeze. Steele's hand moved instinctively to his belt, then relaxed as an old Ford pickup rounded the bend. The truck slowed, and an elderly farmer in overalls leaned out the window. "Everything all right here?" The farmer's weathered face creased with concern. "Saw the smoke from my field. Need me to call for help?" Steele made a decision that would change everything. Just a minor fender bender. We've got it handled, but thanks. He positioned himself to block the farmer's view of Sarah's injuries. The farmer nodded slowly, his eyes taking in Steele's leather vest and the woman's obvious distress. But decades of rural wisdom had taught him when to ask questions and when to simply offer help. Well, if you need anything, I'm just up the road. Miller Farm. After the truck disappeared around the next curve, Steele turned back to Sarah. Her relief was palpable, but so was her awareness of what his lie had cost him. You don't know me, she whispered. Why would you risk lying for me? Steele looked down at this broken woman, who reminded him of everyone he'd failed to protect over the years. Because someone should have lied for people I cared about. Someone should have helped them when they asked. In that moment, Marcus Rodriguez crossed a line he hadn't even realized existed. The Brotherhood had rules about involving outsiders, about taking on problems that weren't club business. But sitting on that empty highway with this terrified woman, Steele understood that some decisions went deeper than patches and protocol. What do you need? He asked simply. Sarah's cracked phone buzzed against the asphalt. Another message appeared through the damaged screen. I'm coming for you. Steele helped Sarah to her feet, supporting her weight as she swayed against him. The morning heat was building, and he could see shock setting in around the edges of her composure. They needed to get away from the road, away from the exposure that made his skin crawl with unease. Can you walk? He asked, scanning the horizon for any sign of approaching vehicles. Sarah nodded, though her grip on his arm told a different story. There's something you need to understand, she said, as they moved slowly toward his motorcycle. The man who did this. He's not some random psychopath. He's my ex-husband. And he's a cop. The words hit Steele like cold water. In his world, police meant complications at best, catastrophe at worst. The Brotherhood had an uneasy relationship with law enforcement. Professional courtesy when possible, hostile distance when necessary. But a cop who'd do this to his own wife was something else entirely. Detective Ray Morrison, Metro PD. Sarah's voice carried the weight of old wounds. We were married for 8 years. It took me 6 of those to understand that the man I fell in love with was just a mask he wore in public. She reached into her purse with trembling fingers and pulled out a photograph, torn roughly in half. The remaining piece showed her smiling beside a young girl, maybe 7 years old, with Sarah's dark eyes and bright smile. The other half had been deliberately ripped away. That's Emma, my daughter. Ray's daughter. Sarah's voice cracked. He has custody. Gort said a police officer was more stable than an unemployed woman with a history of mental health issues. The bitterness in her laugh made Steele wince. Those mental health issues were panic attacks and depression from living with him for years. Steele studied the photograph, noting how Sarah's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, even in this happy moment. When did you leave him? 3 months ago. I'd been planning it for a year, saving money in secret, finding a new apartment across town. I thought I was being careful. She touched the bruise on her cheek gingerly. But Ray always finds out everything. He has friends in every department, patrol, detectives, even dispatch. They tell him things. The sound of another approaching vehicle made them both tense, but it was just a delivery truck that passed without slowing. Steele realized they were still too exposed out here, too vulnerable. Where were you going? He asked, helping her toward a small grove of trees that would provide some cover. Portland. My sister lives there. She's been begging me to come for years, but I couldn't leave Emma. Fresh tears started down Sarah's cheeks. Ray said if I ever tried to take her, he'd make sure I never saw her again. Legal ways, he said. Ways that would stick. Steele had seen enough domestic situations to know how the system could be turned inside out by someone who knew how to work it. A cop would know exactly which buttons to push, which lies would be believed, which evidence would disappear. Last Tuesday, Emma called me crying. Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She said Daddy had been drinking again, that he'd pushed her down for spilling juice on his uniform. That's when I knew I couldn't wait anymore. If I stayed quiet to protect myself, I was abandoning her to him. The photograph fluttered in the morning breeze, and Steele caught it before it could blow away. The little girl's smile reminded him of his sister at that age, bright, trusting, innocent of the darkness adults could carry. "So you confronted him?" I went to his captain. Told them everything. The drinking, the violence, the threats. I even had pictures of some of the bruises. Sarah's laugh was hollow. Captain Martinez listened very carefully, took notes, asked all the right questions. Then he called Ray into his office for what he called a preliminary discussion. Steele could see where this was heading. "And Morrison found out you'd talked within an hour. Ray came to my apartment that night, calmer than I'd seen him in years. He told me exactly how this was going to go. I was having a breakdown, becoming delusional, making wild accusations against a decorated officer. My mental health history would support that story. I'd lose any chance of seeing Emma and probably end up committed for my own safety." A red pickup truck appeared in the distance, moving fast. Too fast for the winding road. Steele's muscles tensed, ready for trouble, but the truck roared past without stopping. Volt's alarm, but his nerves were fraying. "I packed one bag and ran that same night," Sarah continued. "Thought if I got far enough away, started over somewhere new, maybe I could eventually find a way to get Emma back. But Ray, he's not the kind of man who lets go of things he considers his property. Steele made a decision that went against every survival instinct the Brotherhood had drilled into him over 2 decades. He pulled off his leather vest, his kuta, and laid it carefully on his motorcycle seat. The patches that identified him as Hell's Angels, the rockers that declared his territory, the colors that had defined his identity since he was 22 years old. All of it set aside for a woman he'd known for 30 minutes. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he said, rolling up his sleeves. The morning was heating up, and Sarah's face had gone pale with blood loss and shock. "There's an old gas station about 2 miles from here. Been closed for years, but it'll give us cover while I figure this out." Sarah looked at the vest, lying abandoned on the bike seat. "That's important to you, isn't it? What you just took off. It's everything to me." Steele helped her climb onto the back of his Harley. "But some things matter more than colors." The ride to the abandoned station took them through winding back roads that Steele knew by heart. Sarah clung to him with surprising strength, and he could feel her breathing steadying as they put distance between themselves and the crash site. The old Texaco station sat at the intersection of 2 county roads, its windows boarded up and weeds growing through cracks in the concrete. Perfect for keeping low. Steele helped Sarah down and led her into the shade of the old service bay. Her injuries were worse than he'd initially thought. Deep cuts on her arms, possible concussion, and exhaustion that went bone deep. He needed medical supplies, but more importantly, he needed backup he could trust. "I have to make a call," he told her, pulling out his phone. "Someone who can help." Sarah grabbed his wrist. "If you're calling the police, I'm not." Steele's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm calling family," Tommy Kowalski answered on the second ring. "Steele, what's going on, brother? You sound weird." Tommy had been Steele's road captain for 8 years, the closest thing to a brother he'd known, since his own blood family fell apart. If anyone would understand what Steele was about to ask, it would be Tommy. "I need medical supplies. Bandages, antiseptic, maybe some painkillers if you've got them. And I need you to bring them to the old Texaco on County Road 47. Silence on the other end. In the Brotherhood, unusual requests usually meant trouble, and trouble meant questions that needed answering. You hurt, Steele?" "Not me. Someone else. Someone who needs help. Club business?" Steele looked at Sarah, who was listening to every word with fear written across her features. This was the moment where he either pulled his brothers into something dangerous or handled it alone. Either choice carried consequences. "No," he said finally. "Personal business," more silence. Personal business that required emergency medical supplies meant the kind of situation the club preferred to avoid. Complications that could bring heat, attention, legal problems. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Tommy said. "But Steele, this better not blow back on the Brotherhood." After Steele hung up, Sarah studied his face with those 2 knowing eyes. "You're risking everything for me, aren't you? Your friends, your family?" "The Brotherhood has rules," Steele admitted, sitting beside her on an old oil drum. We don't get involved in domestic situations. We don't take on fights that aren't ours. We definitely don't go up against cops without serious backup and club approval. Then why? Because I've spent 23 years following rules that kept me safe, but didn't always keep me right. Steele's voice carried old pain. My mother died when I was 16, beaten to death by her boyfriend while I was at school. Neighbors heard the screaming, but nobody called for help until it was too late. Everyone had their reasons. Didn't want to get involved, wasn't their business. Figured she could handle her own problems. Sarah's hand found his, her fingers cold despite the warming day. I joined the Angels because I needed brothers, needed belonging, found both. But somewhere along the way, I started thinking that being safe was more important than being right. Steele met her eyes. Your daughter's the same age I was when my mother died. If I ride away now, if I follow club rules instead of what I know is right, then I'm just another neighbor who chose not to get involved. Tommy's motorcycle rumbled in the distance, the sound growing closer. Steele stood and put his vest back on, the weight of it feeling different now, heavier with the knowledge of what he was risking, but also lighter with the certainty of his choice. Whatever happens next, he told Sarah, you're not facing it alone anymore. Tommy Kowalski arrived with a medical kit and a face full of questions he wasn't asking yet. Steele watched his road captain take in the scene, abandoned gas station, injured woman, Steele's obvious tension, and make the calculations that came with 20 years of brotherhood experience. This is Sarah, Steele said simply. Sarah, this is Tommy. Tommy knelt beside Sarah with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd patched up plenty of wounds over the years. His hands were gentle despite their size, and he worked in silence while Steele kept watch on the road. Defensive wounds, Tommy said quietly, cleaning the cuts on Sarah's arms. Someone grabbed her hard, probably tried to control her movements. His eyes found Steele's. This isn't a motorcycle accident. Sarah spoke for the first time since Tommy arrived. My ex-husband is Detective Ray Morrison, Metro PD, badge number 4471. The number came out crisp and clear, a detail burned into memory through years of fear. He forced me off the road this morning when I tried to leave town. Tommy's hands stilled for a moment, then continued their work. A cop. A dirty cop, Sarah said. He's been taking money from drug dealers for years, using his position to make evidence disappear, charges get dropped. I found out 3 months ago and tried to report it to his captain. That's when the real violence started. Steele watched Tommy process this information. The Brotherhood had rules about law enforcement. Avoid contact when possible, never escalate unnecessarily, and absolutely never go to war with cops without club approval and overwhelming cause. What Sarah was describing violated every one of those protocols. There's more, Sarah continued, her voice steady now that she'd made the decision to trust them. Ray's been working with distributors who've been flooding the city with fentanyl. Not just looking the other way, actively coordinating shipments, providing security, eliminating competition. Tommy finished bandaging her arm and sat back on his heels. You have proof? Some! Enough to start an investigation if anyone cared to listen. Sarah's hand moved to her purse. But Ray has friends everywhere in the department. Internal affairs, narcotics, even the district attorney's office. They've all been to our house for barbecues. Steele's phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. Seen any interesting traffic on County Road 47 today? He showed the screen to Tommy, whose jaw tightened. Someone was asking questions, and that meant their time was limited. We need to move, Tommy said, packing up the medical supplies. But Steele, you know what this means, right? If we get involved in this, if we go up against a cop and his network, the club's going to demand answers. What would you do? Steele asked. If this was your sister, your daughter. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, memory working behind his eyes. My sister Jenny died of an overdose 8 years ago. Fentanyl cut with something that stopped her heart in 30 seconds. His voice was flat, controlled. She was clean for 2 years before that. Working, going to meetings, getting her life together. Then some dealer sold her poison and walked away, counting his money. Sarah reached out and touched Tommy's arm. I'm sorry, Jenny was 26, had a little boy, my nephew Jake. Tommy stood up, decision made. If this Morrison's helping flood the streets with the stuff that killed her, then maybe club business and personal business aren't so different this time. Steele felt relief wash through him. Having Tommy's support changed everything. Two brothers were infinitely more dangerous than one, especially when those brothers had 20 years of combined experience handling complicated situations. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling a small notebook from her purse. "Ray keeps records. Names, dates, amounts. He's paranoid about his partners cheating him, so he documents everything. I photographed these pages before I ran." She opened the notebook to reveal careful handwriting, names Steele didn't recognize, but amounts that made him whistle low. Morrison wasn't just taking small bribes, he was coordinating major operations. Tommy studied the pages. "This is federal prosecution territory. These numbers, we're talking about millions moving through the city, which is why Ray will never stop hunting me," Sarah said. "It's not about getting his wife back. It's about protecting a criminal enterprise worth more than most people see in a lifetime." Steele's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Bulldog, the club president. Steele looked at Tommy, who shook his head slightly. "Don't answer that yet," Tommy said. "Once Bulldog asks direct questions, we have to give direct answers. Club rules. How long do we have?" "Maybe an hour before he starts wondering why you're not picking up." Tommy shouldered the medical kit. "Where do we go from here?" Detective Ray Morrison stood beside Sarah's crumpled sedan, his service weapon holstered but visible beneath his jacket. The .40 caliber Glock felt heavier than usual today, weighted down by the knowledge that one bullet was missing from the clip. The bullet he'd put through Sarah's rear window 20 minutes ago, before she'd somehow managed to escape into the trees. Morrison walked the crash scene with the methodical attention he'd learned in 15 years of police work. Sarah's blood on the asphalt told him she was hurt, but not how badly. The scattered glass from her driver's side window showed the impact pattern of his bumper when he'd finally forced her off the road. But the lack of a body meant his wife, his property, was still breathing somewhere nearby. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. Captain Martinez. "Cap, it's Ray. Got a situation out on County Road 47. Looks like a hit-and-run. Vehicle fled the scene. Victim's a white female, early 30s, matches the description of that missing person report from this morning." The lie came easily. Morrison had filed the missing person report himself 2 hours ago, claiming Sarah had been acting erratically, talking about suicide, and had disappeared from their home. Standard procedure for when a domestic situation needed official cover. "Injuries?" Martinez asked. "Scene suggests serious trauma, but no body. Either she crawled away from the wreck or someone picked her up." Morrison's eyes swept the road, noting fresh motorcycle tire tracks in the gravel. "I'm thinking the latter. Need backup?" "Not yet. Let me canvass the area first, talk to any witnesses." Morrison's voice carried just the right note of professional concern. "If my wife is out there hurt and confused, I want to find her before she does something dangerous." After hanging up, Morrison accessed the police database through his phone. Traffic cameras, 911 calls, hospital admissions, all the digital breadcrumbs that modern life left behind. Someone had helped Sarah leave this scene, and in Morrison's experience, good Samaritans usually made themselves known to authorities. The fact that no one had called 911 meant Sarah had convinced someone to hide her. The motorcycle tracks told their own story. Heavy bike, experienced rider, someone who knew these back roads well enough to avoid the main highways. Morrison smiled grimly. In a county this size, there weren't many people who fit that profile. His phone rang. Detective Luis Santos, his contact in narcotics and his most reliable partner in their side business. "Ray, got your message about Sarah. You want me to put out a bolo?" "Not officially. This needs to stay quiet until I can assess the situation." Morrison walked back to his unmarked car, mind already working through contingencies. "But I need you to run plate checks on any motorcycle registrations in the county, especially anything connected to the Hells Angels." "The Angels? You think they're involved?" Morrison had been a cop long enough to know that criminals often helped each other, especially when police pressure got too heavy. Sarah had been talking about going to the feds. threatening to expose not just his domestic issues, but the much more profitable arrangements he'd made with certain distributors in the city. If she'd somehow made contact with the wrong people, run the checks, Louise, and see who's been using their credit cards this morning. Someone who helped an injured woman might stop for medical supplies. You got it. Anything else? Morrison touched his weapon again, thinking about how close he'd come to ending this problem permanently on that lonely stretch of road. Sarah's reflexes had been better than he'd expected. Next time, he wouldn't rely on a car accident to do the job. Call Miguel Santos, no relation I know, and tell him we might need some of his people for a recovery operation. Off the books, cash payment. Louise was quiet for a moment. Miguel Santos wasn't law enforcement. He was muscle for the Ramirez Distribution Network, the organization that had been paying Morrison's mortgage for the past 3 years. Calling in cartel help meant this situation had moved beyond domestic dispute into something much more dangerous. Ray, you sure about this? If Sarah talks to the wrong people, she's already talked to the wrong people, Morrison said. Captain Martinez, Internal Affairs, probably half the precinct by now. The only question is whether she's smart enough to talk to the right people. Morrison ended the call and climbed into his car. 20 minutes of police work had given him a starting point. Motorcycle tracks, timing estimates, and a limited number of places someone could hide an injured woman in this part of the county. He'd been hunting people for 15 years, first as a legitimate cop and later as something else entirely. Sarah might have escaped the crash, but she was still in his territory, still within reach of his resources and connections. He started the engine and began systematically working his way through every back road, abandoned building and isolated property in a 10-mile radius. Somewhere nearby, his wife was bleeding and scared and probably telling dangerous stories to people who might actually listen. Morrison intended to find her before those stories spread any further. Steele's cabin sat at the end of a winding dirt road, hidden among pine trees that had grown tall enough to block it from aerial view. He'd bought the property with cash 15 years ago, back when the club's business ventures were more profitable and the IRS wasn't asking too many questions. Now it served as his sanctuary, the one place where Marcus Rodriguez could exist without the weight of brotherhood expectations. Sarah moved slowly through the one-room space, taking in details that told the story of a man living deliberately apart from the world. Military surplus furniture, a wood-burning stove, shelves lined with books on military history and philosophy. But it was the framed document hanging above the fireplace that caught her attention. Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club Charter, she read aloud, founded on the principles of brotherhood, loyalty, and protection of those who cannot protect themselves. Steele followed her gaze to the charter, signed by long-dead founders who'd believed in something larger than themselves. Funny how principles can get complicated when they run into real life. Sarah settled into a worn leather chair while Steele gathered medical supplies from a footlocker. The cabin's isolation felt like safety after hours of exposure and fear, but she could see the tension Steele carried in his shoulders. Helping her was costing him something important. "Tell me about your family," she said, as Steele cleaned her wounds with gentle efficiency. Not much to tell anymore. Steele's hands stilled for a moment. "Father died in Vietnam when I was 2. Mother raised me and my sister Jenny alone until she met Frank Delacroix when I was 14. Frank was the problem." "Frank was a problem." Steele's voice carried old pain, carefully controlled. "Drank too much, hit too hard, and knew exactly how to make it look like accidents when neighbors got suspicious. Broken ribs from falling downstairs, black eyes from walking into doors. The usual creative writing that goes with domestic violence." Sarah recognized the pattern, the careful language used to describe unspeakable realities. "Your mother tried to get help." 3 times. Called the police, filed reports, even went to a women's shelter once. Steele resumed cleaning her cuts, his touch professional and careful. But Frank was a veteran, had friends in the department, knew which judges to talk to and which stories to tell. System kept sending Mum back home with promises that things would be different, but they weren't. They never are. Steele's hands were steady, but Sarah could see the memory working behind his eyes. The night I graduated high school, Frank came home drunk and angry about something at work. Mom tried to keep him away from Jenny, who was only 14. Frank put her through the living room window. Sarah's breath caught. Did she survive? 3 days in intensive care before her brain swelling went down enough to know she'd be okay. Steele finished bandaging Sarah's arm and sat back. That's when I learned that sometimes the system doesn't protect people who need protecting. Sometimes you have to step outside the system. What did you do? Nothing that night. But I started making plans. Steele moved to the window, checking the tree line for any sign of movement. Took me 6 months to find the right opportunity. Frank liked to drink at Murphy's Tavern every Friday night, then drive home drunk through the canyon roads. Sarah understood without needing details. An accident. Brake lines can be surprisingly fragile when they're 20 years old. Steele's voice was matter-of-fact, without apology or regret. Frank's truck went through the guardrail on Devil's Curve, doing about 70. Took the county 3 days to find the wreckage. And your mother remarried a good man 2 years later. Jenny finished school, went to college, became a nurse. Steele returned to his chair, the confession apparently lifting some invisible weight. They never knew what I did, never needed to know. Sarah studied his face, seeing the man who'd been willing to cross lines to protect the people he loved. Is that why you joined the Hells Angels? The Brotherhood? Partly. Also because I needed belonging after what I'd done. Needed people who understood that sometimes violence is the only language certain people understand. Steele gestured toward the charter on the wall. The original Angels were World War II veterans who couldn't adjust to civilian life. They formed brotherhoods based on the idea that real men protect their own and don't rely on systems that fail when you need them most. And now the brotherhood's evolved. We've got lawyers and accountants, legitimate businesses and political connections. We try to work within the system when we can. Steele met her eyes. But sometimes the system fails people like you. Sometimes brotherhood means going back to those original principles. Sarah felt tears starting again, but this time they carried relief instead of fear. You really mean it, don't you? About helping me. Steele looked at the charter again, then back at her. My mother died, believing that no one cared enough to protect her. Your daughter's the same age Jenny was when Frank put her through that window. His voice was quiet, but absolutely certain. I won't let Emma grow up believing the same thing my mother died believing. Tommy arrived at Steele's cabin without his usual easy smile, and Sarah knew immediately that something had changed. The tension radiating from him filled the small space as he stepped inside, his eyes taking inventory of the scene. Steele's medical supplies, Sarah's bandaged wounds, the careful way they both watched him for signs of threat. We need to talk, Tommy said to Steele. Privately. Steele glanced at Sarah, who nodded and moved to the small kitchen area, giving them the illusion of privacy in the one-room cabin. But voices carried in the confined space, and she couldn't help overhearing the conversation that would determine her immediate future. Bulldog's asking questions, Tommy said in a low voice. Wants to know why you missed the officers' meeting this morning? Why your phone's been going straight to voicemail? Why Jake Morrison saw you talking to some woman at a crash site on County Road 47. Sarah's blood went cold. Jake Morrison. That had to be Ray's cousin, the patrol officer who'd always been particularly cruel during family gatherings, making jokes about keeping women in line. Jake Morrison. Steele's voice carried dangerous edge. Ray's cousin. Yeah, apparently he was running radar on Highway 9 when he got a call about the accident. Drove over to check it out, saw you and a woman leaving the scene on your bike? Tommy's voice dropped even lower. Bulldog wants to know if you're involved in something that could bring heat on the club. Sarah watched Steele process this information, seeing the calculations working behind his eyes. The brotherhood that had defined his adult life was now questioning his loyalty, while the woman he'd chosen to protect was bringing exactly the kind of attention the club worked hard to avoid. What did you tell him? Steele asked. Nothing yet. But Steele, you know how this works. If Bulldog calls a formal meeting and asks direct questions, I can't lie for you. Brotherhood rules. Tommy sat heavily in the room's only other chair. And if this woman's connected to Detective Morrison in any way, she's his wife, ex-wife. Steele's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. He's been beating her for years. Tried to kill her this morning. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him struggling with competing loyalties. Finally, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal object, a Bronze Star medal with a faded ribbon. You know what this is? Tommy held the medal carefully, reverently. Your dad's medal. Vietnam. 3 tours. Came home with shrapnel in his leg and nightmares that lasted 20 years. Tommy's voice carried old pain. But you know what he told me the day I joined the Angels? He said the Brotherhood was sacred because it was based on protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Sarah felt a spark of hope at those words, but Tommy wasn't finished. He also told me about a village called My Lai, where good soldiers followed bad orders and innocent people died because no one was brave enough to say no. Tommy met Steele's eyes. Said the hardest thing about being a brother, whether in the army or the club, was knowing when loyalty to the group meant betraying everything the group was supposed to stand for. Steele leaned forward. What are you saying, Tommy? I'm saying my dad had a sister named Catherine. Sweet girl, married her high school sweetheart right out of high school. Guy seemed perfect. Good job, nice family, went to church every Sunday. Tommy's hands tightened on the medal. Took 3 years before anyone realized he was putting her in the hospital every few months with accidents and falls. What happened? Family tried to handle it quietly. Talked to the husband, made threats, offered help. Nothing worked. Catherine kept going back, kept making excuses, kept believing things would change. Tommy's voice grew flat, controlled. Until one night, he went too far and she didn't wake up. Sarah felt tears starting at the recognition in Tommy's story. How many women had died while their families tried to work within systems that weren't designed to protect them. Dad always blamed himself for following family rules instead of doing what was right. Said if he'd been willing to break a few rules earlier, Catherine might have lived to see her children grow up. Tommy looked at Sarah directly for the first time. How old is your daughter? 7, Sarah whispered. Tommy nodded slowly, decision crystallizing in his expression. 7 years old is too young to lose her mother because the men in her life were too worried about following rules to do what was right. He stood up and walked to Steele, holding out the Bronze Star. This medal represents my father's courage in Vietnam. But his real courage came 20 years later, when he told me that sometimes being a brother means standing up to other brothers. Steele accepted the medal, understanding the weight of what Tommy was offering. And the club? The club will survive whatever heat comes from this. Catherine Morrison won't survive if we follow protocol instead of conscience. Tommy moved toward the door. But Steele? If we do this, if we go against Morrison and his police connections, we do it right. We do it smart, and we do it together. The burner phone Steele purchased at a gas station 20 miles from his cabin felt foreign in his hands, lightweight plastic instead of the heavy military-grade device he normally carried. But normal phones left digital footprints, and after Tommy's warning about police surveillance, Steele wasn't taking any chances with technology that could be tracked. We can't stay here, he told Sarah as she gathered the few belongings Tommy had brought from her abandoned apartment. Morrison's cousin saw us together, which means every cop in the county will be looking for my bike within the hour. Sarah paused in her packing, a framed photo of Emma trembling in her hands. Where can we go? He has resources everywhere, police, informants, people who owe him favors. I know someone who specializes in making people disappear when they need to. Steele dialed a number he'd memorized years ago but never expected to use. Underground railroad for women escaping bad situations. The voice that answered was gravelly, cautious. Yeah, this is Steele Rodriguez. Hell's Angels, Chapter 47. I need to speak to Maria Santos. Maria, don't talk to bikers. Tell her it's about a woman running from a cop who's trying to kill her. Tell her the cop's name is Detective Ray Morrison. The line went quiet, then, hold on. While they waited, Steele monitored the scanner he kept for club business. Police chatter was heating up. Multiple units coordinating a search pattern that seemed to center on his general area. Morrison was mobilizing serious resources for what should have been a simple domestic dispute. Rodriguez, A new voice, female, sharp with intelligence and years of hard experience. Maria Santos. Who's asking? Someone who needs help getting a woman to safety. Someone the system won't protect. I don't work with bikers. Nothing personal. But your brotherhood and mine don't usually see eye to eye on women's issues. Steele understood her reluctance. The Hells Angels had a complicated history with women, somewhere between protective and possessive, depending on the chapter and the decade. But desperation made him honest. This woman's running from Detective Ray Morrison. He tried to kill her this morning, and he's got half the police department helping him track her down. Steele kept his voice level. She's got a 7-year-old daughter who's still in Morrison's custody. Silence on the other end, then Morrison. Metro PD, you know him? I know his work. 3 women in the past 2 years, all supposedly accidental deaths or suicides. All had filed domestic violence reports shortly before dying. Maria's voice carried cold fury. What kind of help are you looking for? A safe house, new identity, maybe transport out of state. Steele watched Sarah's face brighten with hope. And eventually help getting her daughter back. That's federal prosecutor territory. Witness protection, custody battles, going up against a decorated police officer? Maria paused. Why is a Hell's Angel getting involved in this? Steele thought about his mother's funeral, about Jenny's recovery from her injuries, about the charter hanging on his cabin wall. Because sometimes the system fails people who need protection. And sometimes brotherhood means standing up to bullies, even when those bullies wear badges. Another pause. Then there's a truck stop on Interstate 40, mile marker 127, parking area behind the main building. Be there in 2 hours. How will we recognize? You won't. We'll recognize you. The line went dead. Steele turned to find Sarah staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You're really doing this? Risking everything for someone you barely know. I know enough. Steele shouldered a bag containing emergency supplies, cash, ammunition, first aid kit. I know you're brave enough to run when staying meant dying. I know you love your daughter enough to risk everything to protect her. And I know Morrison's the kind of man who needs to be stopped. The scanner crackled with new activity. Multiple units converging on Steele's road, ETA 15 minutes. Sarah heard it too, and moved toward the door with sudden urgency. They found us. Steele grabbed his leather jacket and the burner phone. Not yet, but they found my address. He led Sarah toward a hidden door in the cabin's back wall. Emergency exit. Comes out near where I keep the backup bike. As they slipped through the concealed passage, Steele could hear helicopters approaching from the east. Morrison had called in serious resources, either because he was desperate or because Sarah represented a bigger threat than simple domestic violence would justify. The backup motorcycle was a stripped-down Sportster, fast and maneuverable but uncomfortable for long rides. Sarah climbed on behind Steele without complaint, and they roared away from the cabin just as the first police cars appeared through the trees. Behind them, Steele's sanctuary burned with red and blue lights, but ahead lay the promise of people who understood that some fights were worth having, regardless of the cost. The truck stop at mile marker 127 felt like neutral territory, a place where truckers, travelers, and people running from various troubles could exist anonymously under fluorescent lights and the smell of diesel fuel. Sarah sat across from Steele in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. "There's something I haven't told you," she said, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the restaurant. "About why Ray is so desperate to find me." Steele had been expecting this moment. In his experience, people running for their lives usually carried secrets that explained the extremes others would go to silence them. "What kind of something?" Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small USB drive, the kind office workers used for transferring files between computers. It looked innocuous, but Steele could see from Sarah's expression that this tiny device carried explosive potential. 3 weeks before I ran, I was using Ray's computer to pay bills online. He'd been drinking, passed out in his chair, and I needed to transfer money from savings. Sarah turned the drive over in her fingers like a worry stone. But his computer was still logged into his police database account. Steele felt cold understanding wash over him. You saw something you weren't supposed to see. I saw everything I wasn't supposed to see. Sarah's voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. Ray's been taking money from the Ramirez cartel for 3 years. Not small bribes to look the other way. Major payments for active coordination and protection. The words hung in the air between them, like a physical presence. Steele had heard rumors about police corruption, but the amounts Sarah was describing suggested something far beyond typical cop-criminal cooperation. How much money? Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions over the 3 years. Sarah connected the USB drive to her phone, pulling up files she'd obviously studied extensively. Ray's been providing security for major drug shipments, eliminating competing dealers through targeted arrests, and making evidence disappear when cartel members get caught. Steele studied the documents on Sarah's phone screen. Bank transfers, meeting schedules, detailed records of police operations that had mysteriously failed to catch their intended targets. It painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond one dirty cop. This is why he's hunting you so hard. Not because you're his wife, but because you're a witness to federal crimes. It gets worse. Sarah scrolled to a different file. Ray's been selling information about ongoing DEA investigations to the cartel. 3 federal agents have died in the past 2 years during operations that Ray had advanced knowledge about. Steele's military background helped him grasp the implications immediately. Morrison wasn't just corrupt. He was actively participating in a criminal enterprise that had resulted in law enforcement deaths. The USB drive in Sarah's possession contained evidence that could bring down not just Morrison, but potentially dozens of other corrupt officials. Who else knows about this? Nobody. I was too scared to tell anyone before now. Sarah's hands shook as she disconnected the drive. But Ray knows I have it. The night before I ran, he caught me printing some of these files. That's when he told me exactly what would happen if I ever tried to use them against him. What did he say? That he'd make sure Emma disappeared. Not just custody, disappeared. And that I'd be found dead from suicide or overdose within a week. Sarah's voice broke slightly. He showed me photos of other women who'd supposedly killed themselves after making accusations against police officers. Women who'd had their children taken away just before they died. Steele understood now why Morrison had been willing to call in police helicopters and coordinate county-wide searches. The evidence Sarah carried could destroy not just his career, but potentially result in federal death penalty charges. A desperate man with cartel connections and police resources was capable of extreme measures. We need to get this to the right people, Steele said. Who are the right people? Ray has contacts everywhere, police, prosecutors, even some federal agents. Sarah's laugh was bitter. How do we know who we can trust when the system itself is compromised? Steele thought about Maria Santos and her underground network, about Tommy's willingness to stand against club pressure, about the founding principles written on his cabin charter. Sometimes working outside the system was the only way to make the system work. We make sure so. Many people have this information that Morrison can't. Silence all of them. Steele made a decision that would change everything. But first, we make sure he can't hurt your daughter while we're exposing him. Sarah looked up with hope and fear warring in her expression. How? By making sure the cartel understands that Morrison has become a liability they can't afford to protect. The photographs on Sarah's USB drive told a story that made Steele's blood run cold. Morrison wasn't just taking cartel money, he was wearing their tattoos. The images showed him at what appeared to be private parties, his shirt off, revealing ink that marked him as far more than a corrupt cop taking bribes. These were taken at Miguel Ramirez's compound outside the city, Sarah explained, scrolling through the digital evidence. Ray thought he was being careful, but he always gets careless when he drinks. Started taking photos with his phone, showing off his connections. Steele studied the cartel tattoo on Morrison's shoulder blade, a serpent wrapped around a skull, with Spanish words that proclaimed loyalty unto death. This isn't corruption. This is full membership. Miguel Ramirez runs the Southwest distribution network for the Sinaloa cartel. Ray's been his inside man for years. But these photos prove he's crossed the line from asset to active participant. Sarah's voice carried the weight of someone who'd lived with this knowledge for weeks. If this gets out, it won't just destroy Ray's career. It'll trigger a federal investigation that could bring down the entire network. Steele's phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. Bulldog called emergency meeting. All officers required to attend. What do I tell him? Steele looked at Sarah, understanding the impossible position they were all in. The club couldn't protect him if they didn't understand what they were protecting him from. But telling them about the cartel evidence would force the Brotherhood to choose between loyalty to him and their own survival. What happens when the cartel finds out Morrison's been photographing their operations? Steele asked. They'll kill him, but not before they eliminate anyone who's seen the evidence. Sarah's hand moved protectively over the USB drive. That includes me, you, Tommy, and anyone else who knows what we know. Steele's phone rang. Tommy's voice was tight with stress. Steele, where are you? Morrison just showed up at the clubhouse with 3 other cops and a federal marshal. They're asking questions about your whereabouts, showing photos of you and some woman, federal marshal. Claims there's a warrant out for the woman. Fugitive from justice, armed and dangerous, possibly holding you against your will. Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper. But Steele, something's wrong. Bulldog doesn't trust Morrison. Says the paperwork doesn't look right. Steele felt a surge of hope. If Morrison was desperate enough to involve federal authorities, he was making mistakes that experienced criminals like the club leadership would recognize. Listen to me carefully. Tommy, Morrison's not just a dirty cop. He's cartel. Full member tattoos, the whole thing. The woman he's hunting has evidence that could bring down a multi-million-dollar drug operation. Silence on the other end, then, Jesus Christ, Steele. You know what that means? Steele knew exactly what it meant. The Hells Angels had their own complicated relationship with various criminal enterprises, but they maintained strict neutrality when it came to cartel operations. Getting involved in cartel business was the kind of mistake that could get entire chapters eliminated. It means we're all in danger if Morrison thinks we're helping his wife expose him. What do you need? Time to get the evidence to someone who can use it, and protection for the woman and her daughter. Steele made a decision that would test every bond of brotherhood he'd built over 23 years. Tommy, if the club wants to cut me loose to protect themselves, I'll understand. This isn't club business anymore. Like hell it isn't. Tommy's voice carried conviction that surprised Steele. Morrison brought federal heat to our clubhouse, threatened our brothers, and lied about the nature of his business. That makes it our business. Through the truck stop's windows, Steele saw a black SUV with tinted windows pull into the parking lot. 2 men in expensive suits climbed out, their movements carrying the controlled tension of professional violence. Tommy, I've got to go. Cartel soldiers just showed up at my location. Steele ended the call and grabbed Sarah's hand. We're leaving, now. They moved quickly through the truck stop, using the crowds and maze of corridors to avoid the main entrance. But as they approached the rear exit, Steele saw another SUV positioning itself in the back parking lot. The cartel had resources that matched or exceeded law enforcement, surveillance, coordination, and the kind of patience that came with unlimited funding. The bathroom window, Sarah whispered, pointing toward the women's restroom. They slipped inside, and Steele boosted Sarah through the small window that opened onto a loading dock. As he climbed through after her, he could hear voices in the main restaurant, calm, professional Spanish, asking questions about a man and woman who'd been seen together. The stolen Honda motorcycle they'd used to replace Steele's conspicuous Harley was parked behind a semi-trailer, hidden but accessible. They climbed on, and Steele started the engine, keeping the revs low to minimize noise. As they pulled away from the truck stop, Steele could see the cartel soldiers spreading out through the building, beginning a systematic search that would eventually lead them to the bathroom window. But by then, Steele and Sarah were already disappearing into the maze of Interstate Highway, carrying evidence that could topple an empire if they lived long enough to deliver it. The Hells Angels clubhouse had never felt hostile to Steele before. He'd spent countless hours in the converted warehouse, planning rides, settling disputes, celebrating victories and mourning losses with men he considered closer than blood family. But as he stood before the assembled brotherhood at Tommy's urgent request, he could feel the weight of suspicion and concern radiating from faces that had once offered unconditional support. Bulldog Martinez, club president for 8 years, sat behind the scarred wooden table that served as his seat of authority. The silver ring on his right hand bore the club's death's head insignia, a symbol Steele had once been proud to earn through years of loyalty and sacrifice. Now it felt like a judge's gavel waiting to fall. "Explain to me," Bulldog said, in the careful voice he used for serious club business, "why Detective Morrison and 3 federal agents spent 2 hours in my clubhouse asking about your whereabouts. Explain why there's a federal warrant for a woman named Sarah Chen, who multiple witnesses have seen with you." Steele had prepared for this moment during the ride from the truck stop. But preparation didn't make the choice easier. The Brotherhood had rules about bringing outside heat onto the club, about involving members in non-club business that could jeopardize everyone's security. What he was about to say would violate multiple protocols. The woman's name is Sarah Chen Morrison. She's Detective Morrison's ex-wife, and she's carrying evidence that he's been working with the Sinaloa cartel for 3 years. Steele kept his voice steady, factual. Morrison tried to kill her yesterday, morning to prevent that evidence from reaching federal prosecutors. Murmurs ran through the assembled brothers. 15 men who'd seen enough criminal activity to understand the implications of cartel involvement. But it was Bulldog's expression that worried Steele most. The president's face had gone carefully neutral, which meant he was calculating risks and benefits with the cold precision that had kept the chapter out of federal prison for nearly a decade. "You're telling me you've involved this club in a war between a corrupt cop and the Mexican cartel?" Bulldog's voice carried dangerous quiet. "Without club authorization, without consulting the officers, without considering the consequences to your brothers. I'm telling you I helped a woman escape from someone who was trying to murder her." Steele felt the support in the room shifting, loyalty being weighed against survival. Everything else is secondary to that. Nothing is secondary to the safety of this brotherhood. Bulldog stood, the president's ring catching the overhead lights. "Steele, you've been a good brother for 23 years, but you've put every man in this room at risk for a woman you barely know." Tommy stepped forward from the line of assembled brothers. "Bulldog, there's more you need to know. Morrison isn't just corrupt, he's cartel, full member, with tattoos to prove it. The evidence this woman carries could bring down a multi-million-dollar operation, which makes it even more dangerous for us to be involved." Bulldog's logic was unassailable from a survival standpoint. The cartel doesn't distinguish between active participants and innocent bystanders. If they think we're helping expose their operations, they'll eliminate this entire chapter. Steele had known this moment would come, but the finality of it still hit like a physical blow. The brotherhood that had defined his adult life was choosing institutional survival over individual conscience. He couldn't blame them for the decision, but he couldn't accept it either. "Then I resign from the club." Steele began removing his vest, the colors that had been his identity for more than 2 decades. "I'll handle this alone. No club involvement, no heat on the brotherhood." "It's not that simple, Steele." Bulldog's voice carried genuine regret. "You know too much about club business to just walk away. And Morrison's already connected you to us in federal records." Steele understood. In the criminal world, retirement was rarely voluntary or simple. Knowledge was liability, and liability had to be managed. The club couldn't let him leave with 23 years of secrets, especially not while he was involved in something that could bring federal investigations. "What are you saying, Bulldog?" "I'm saying you have a choice. Turn the woman over to Morrison, convince her to destroy the evidence, and we'll protect you from any federal consequences." Bulldog's expression was grim but determined. "Or continue down this path alone with the understanding that the club can't help you and can't afford to let you compromise us." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke. Steele looked around the room at men he'd called brother, seeing the mixture of sympathy and resolve in their faces. They understood his position, but they couldn't support his choice. Tommy stepped closer, close enough to speak without the others hearing. "I'm with you, whatever you decide. But Steele, think about what you're giving up." Steele looked at the vest in his hands, then at the faces of men who'd shared 23 years of loyalty and sacrifice. Then he thought about Emma Morrison, 7 years old, trapped with a father who was capable of murder. "Some things matter more than brotherhood," Steele said, laying his colors on Bulldog's table. "I hope someday you all understand that." Steele's father's combat knife felt heavier than usual as he cleaned it with methodical precision. The way Sergeant First Class Miguel Rodriguez had taught him during those rare moments when the old soldier had shared stories from the jungles of Vietnam. The Ka-Bar's 7-inch blade bore scratches from 40 years of use, first by his father in Southeast Asian combat zones, later by Steele during his own military service, and now as preparation for what might be his final confrontation. "Tell me about the mining facility," Steele said to Sarah, who was studying detailed blueprints Tommy had procured through contacts in the construction industry. "Abandoned for 12 years, but the structure's still sound." Sarah traced escape routes with her finger. "Ray used to bring me here when we were dating. Said it was romantic, all that industrial decay. I thought it was creepy, but I memorized the layout anyway. The Blackstone Mining Company had extracted copper from the mountainside for 60 years before environmental concerns and dropping mineral prices forced closure. What remained was a maze of tunnels, processing facilities, and equipment that provided perfect terrain for the kind of confrontations Steele was planning. Multiple entry points, limited visibility, plenty of cover. Tommy spread additional maps across the cabin's kitchen table. "If we can draw Morrison and his people here, we control the battlefield." Steele appreciated Tommy's tactical thinking, but the weight of what they were planning troubled him. "You don't have to do this, brother. I've already cost you your standing with the club. Club voted to cut you loose, not me. I made my own choice." Tommy's grin was fierce, almost feral. "Besides, someone needs to watch your back when this goes sideways." Sarah looked up from the blueprints. "It doesn't have to go sideways. If we can get Morrison to the facility, if we can get him talking, record his admissions." She gestured to the small digital recorder Tommy had provided. "Federal prosecutors need evidence they can use in court, not just dead criminals." Steele understood her hope, but his military experience had taught him to prepare for worst-case scenarios. Morrison was desperate, cartel-connected, and running out of options. Men in that position rarely surrendered quietly. "What about Emma?" Steele asked. "Even if we expose Morrison, even if we get the evidence to federal authorities, your daughter's still in his custody." Sarah's face tightened with pain that never fully left her features. "Maria Santos says her organization has contacts in child protective services. If Morrison's arrested on federal charges, if there's evidence of his violence and criminal activity, emergency custody orders can happen quickly. And if something goes wrong tonight, if Morrison doesn't survive the confrontation, then Emma grows up knowing her mother was brave enough to fight for her, instead of growing up with a father who kills people who threaten his criminal enterprise." Sarah's voice carried absolute conviction. "Either way, she's safer with Morrison exposed than with him free to keep hurting people." Steele nodded, understanding the calculation. Sometimes protecting the innocent required accepting terrible risks. His father had taught him that lesson in a Vietnamese village whose name he'd never learned. When civilians needed protection and rules of engagement had to be balanced against human necessity. Tommy checked his watch. "Morrison should be getting our message about now." They'd sent the corrupt detective a simple text from Sarah's phone. "Meet me at Blackstone Mining. Come alone, and we can discuss terms. Bring backup, and the evidence goes to the FBI tonight." "He won't come alone," Steele said, testing the knife's edge against his thumb. "But he'll come. The cartel evidence is too dangerous for him to leave outstanding. How many men do you think he'll bring?" "Depends on whether he's thinking like a cop or like a cartel member." Steele sheathed the knife and checked his pistol, a .45 ACP that had served him reliably for 15 years. If he's still trying to maintain his police cover, maybe 2 or 3 officers he can trust. If he's gone full cartel, could be a small army. Sarah packed the USB drive into a waterproof case, along with copies they'd made at a print shop in the next county. Maria's people will wait exactly 4 hours after we leave for the facility. If we don't contact them by then, they'll assume something went wrong and deliver copies to every federal agency that handles corruption cases. Dead man's switch, Tommy nodded approvingly. Smart. Steele looked around the small cabin that had been his sanctuary for 15 years, knowing he might not see it again. The framed charter still hung above the fireplace. Its words, about protecting the innocent, carrying new meaning after everything that had happened. Last chance to walk away, he told Tommy and Sarah. Once we leave here, once we commit to this confrontation, there's no going back. Tommy grinned and shouldered his gear bag. Brother, I've been looking for a good fight for months. Sarah stood and checked her own weapon, a .38 revolver Maria's people had provided. I've been running for 3 months. Tonight, Ray Morrison finds out what happens when someone stops running and starts fighting back. The abandoned hard hat that Steele found near the mine entrance bore the faded logo of Honest. American Labor, Blackstone Mining Company. Here to 1952. He placed it carefully on a rusted equipment housing where Morrison would be sure to see it. A symbol of everything the corrupt detective had betrayed in his pursuit of cartel money. Morrison arrived precisely at midnight, his headlights cutting through the mountain darkness as 3 vehicles wound their way up the access road. Steele counted the approaching lights from his concealed position in the old Crusher building. Morrison's unmarked police car, followed by 2 black SUVs that screamed cartel resources rather than law enforcement backup. 6 men, maybe 7, Tommy's voice crackled through the radio earpiece they'd positioned throughout the facility. Morrison's bringing serious firepower. Sarah's position in the mine office gave her clear sightlines to the main approach. I can see Miguel Santos in the second vehicle. Morrison called in cartel muscle for this. Steele felt his tactical instincts engage, the same cold clarity that had served him during military operations where split-second decisions meant survival. Morrison's choice to bring cartel enforcers instead of police backup revealed everything about his state of mind. He was no longer thinking like a law enforcement officer trying to contain a domestic situation. He was thinking like a criminal, eliminating threats to a multi-million-dollar operation. The vehicles stopped in the facility's main yard, positioning themselves to control the access road while providing overlapping fields of fire. Morrison climbed out of his car slowly, his service weapon visible in a tactical holster, but his body language suggesting nervous energy barely held in check. Sarah. Morrison's voice echoed off the concrete structures, carrying a tone Steele recognized from his own father's worst moments, the deadly calm of violence barely restrained. I know you're here. Time to stop playing games. Steele watched through night vision binoculars as Miguel Santos emerged from the lead SUV. The cartel enforcer was everything Steele had expected. Professional, well-armed, and radiating the controlled menace of someone who'd killed before and would kill again without hesitation. Mrs. Morrison, Santos called in accented English, your husband has explained the situation. Return the property that belongs to us, and this conversation ends peacefully. Property. Steele noted how Santos referred to the evidence, not as Sarah's possessions or stolen materials, but as cartel property that had been temporarily misplaced. It confirmed what the USB files had suggested. Morrison wasn't just working with the cartel, he was working for them. Sarah's voice came through the radio, steady despite the circumstances. The recording equipment is running. Whatever they say now goes to federal prosecutors, whether we survive this or not. Steele keyed his radio twice in acknowledgement, then watched Morrison gesture for his men to spread out through the facility. The corrupt detective was following tactical protocols he'd learned in police academy, treating the mining complex like a crime scene to be systematically cleared. But he was making the mistake of assuming his opponents would behave like typical criminals rather than individuals with military training and intimate knowledge of the terrain. I'm going to make this simple for you, Sarah, Morrison called, moving deeper into the facility. You have something that belongs to very dangerous people. People who don't negotiate, don't show mercy, and don't leave loose ends. Give me the USB drive, and maybe we can work out an arrangement that keeps you and Emma alive. The mention of Emma made Steele's jaw clench with controlled rage. Morrison was using his own daughter as leverage, threatening a 7-year-old child to protect his criminal enterprise. Some lines should never be crossed, and Morrison had crossed that line long ago. Santos split his men into 2 groups, sending one team toward the Crusher building, where Steele waited, while he led the other toward the mine office, where Sarah had positioned herself. Professional tactics, but predictable ones, that Steele had anticipated during their planning session. Contact in 30 seconds, Tommy's voice warned. Eastern approach, 2 tangos moving toward the main tunnel entrance. Steele checked his father's combat knife one final time, then settled into the patient stillness that combat operations required. The mining facility's industrial decay provided perfect concealment, the shadows and abandoned equipment creating a maze where sound traveled unpredictably and sightlines disappeared around every corner. Morrison's voice carried through, the night air closer now. You know what the funny thing is, Sarah? I actually thought about letting you go, taking the money and Emma and starting over somewhere new. His laugh was bitter, dangerous. But then you had to involve other people. Had to turn my personal business into everyone else's problem. Steele heard footsteps approaching his position, careful, professional movement that suggested military or law enforcement training. Santos's men were good, but they were operating in unfamiliar terrain against opponents who'd had hours to prepare the battlefield. Now it's not just about protecting my business, Morrison continued. It's about sending a message to anyone else who thinks they can threaten what I've built. The small recording device Steele had taped under the rusted conveyor belt, captured every word as Morrison moved deeper into the mining facility, his voice carrying the arrogant confidence of someone who believed he controlled the situation. What the corrupt detective didn't realize was that his confession was being transmitted in real time to Maria Santos's contacts in federal law enforcement. You want to know the truth, Sarah? Morrison's voice echoed through the concrete structures. I've been cleaning up this city for 3 years, taking money from scumbag dealers, making their competition disappear, keeping the streets safer for decent people like Emma. Steele positioned himself in the shadows of the old Crusher mechanism, watching Morrison approach through night vision scope. The detective's tactical movement was professional but predictable. He was sweeping the facility like a crime scene rather than hunting enemies who might be hunting him. The funny thing is, Morrison continued, apparently convinced that confession would somehow justify his actions, the feds have been trying to infiltrate the Ramirez operation for 5 years. They've spent millions, lost 3 agents, and never got close to Miguel's inner circle. But me, I waltzed right in because I had something they needed, legitimate police authority. Through his earpiece, Steele heard Tommy's whispered update. 2 tangos moving on Sarah's position. Taking them now. The sound of brief, violent contact echoed through the tunnels, muffled impacts, a strangled cry cut short, then silence. Tommy's voice came back calm and controlled. Area secure. Moving to secondary position. Morrison heard the sounds too, his confession stopping mid-sentence as tactical awareness replaced arrogant monologue. Santos, report! Steele watched the detective's body language. Change from predator to prey as the realization hit him that he was operating in hostile territory against opponents with superior positioning and knowledge of the terrain. You think you're smart, don't you? Morrison called, his voice now carrying desperation instead of confidence. Think you can expose me and walk away? The cartel doesn't work that way, Steele. Even if you kill me, even if you get the evidence to federal prosecutors, Miguel's people will hunt you and Sarah and anyone who helped you until they're all dead. Maybe, Steele replied, stepping into the light where Morrison could see him. But at least Emma will grow up knowing her mother was brave enough to fight for her. Morrison spun toward Steele's voice, his service weapon coming up in a smooth draw that spoke of years of police training. But Steele had spent months studying the facility's layout, positioning himself where industrial shadows and abandoned equipment created perfect concealment. "There's something you need to understand about the cartel." "Rodriguez," Morrison said, trying to locate Steele's position. "They don't just kill their enemies. They make examples. Sarah dies slowly, screaming. Emma disappears forever. Your friend Tommy gets fed to the desert, and you get to watch all of it happen before they finally put you out of your misery. Is that what happened to the other women?" Steele's voice came from a different direction now, confusing Morrison's targeting. "The ones who supposedly committed suicide after filing domestic violence reports? Casualties of war." Morrison's attempt at justification sounded hollow even to himself. Sometimes protecting the greater good requires individual sacrifices. Steele had heard enough. The recording device had captured everything federal prosecutors would need to build cases against Morrison and his cartel connections. But more importantly, Morrison had revealed the depth of his corruption and his willingness to harm innocent people to protect his criminal enterprise. "Sarah," Steele called. "Now." Floodlights suddenly blazed throughout the facility as Sarah activated the mining company's emergency lighting system. Morrison, who'd been relying on darkness and superior firepower, found himself exposed and temporarily blinded in the industrial glare. Steele moved with the fluid precision his military training had drilled into him, using the split second of Morrison's disorientation to close the distance between them. The corrupt detective's weapon came up, but Steele was already inside his targeting radius. His father's combat knife finding the space between Morrison's ribs with surgical accuracy. Morrison's eyes went wide with shock and pain, his service weapon falling from nerveless fingers to clatter on the concrete floor. You don't understand," he gasped, blood frothing from his lips. "The cartel, they'll never stop hunting." "Let them come," Steele said quietly, supporting Morrison's weight as the detective's knees buckled. "Federal agents are already moving on Miguel's operation. Your recorded confession just gave them everything they needed for conspiracy charges, racketeering, and accessory to murder of federal agents." Morrison's face went pale as the implications hit him. "You were recording everything, including your threats against Emma and your admission of helping to kill federal agents." Steele helped Morrison sit against a concrete pillar, the fight going out of the corrupt cop as his life bled away. "The evidence goes to prosecutors whether you live or die. But your daughter gets to grow up free either way." The federal marshal's badge caught the morning sunlight as Deputy Marshal Jennifer Walsh approached the mining facility, her team of agents spreading out to secure the scene with professional efficiency. Steele sat against a concrete barrier, his hands zip-tied behind his back, watching federal law enforcement finally arrive to clean up the mess that local police corruption had created. "Mr. Rodriguez," Marshal Walsh said, kneeling beside Steele with the kind of respectful caution reserved for individuals whose legal status remained unclear. "I'm Deputy Marshal Walsh, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to talk." Steele nodded toward Morrison's body, now covered by a tarp the federal team had provided. "Everything you need to know is on the recording device under the old conveyor belt." Morrison confessed to 3 years of cartel collaboration, including information that led to the deaths of federal agents. Walsh signaled to one of her technicians, who began processing the scene with the meticulous attention that federal investigations required. "We've been building a case against the Ramirez cartel for 5 years. Morrison's recorded confession just gave us everything we needed for conspiracy charges that will hold up in federal court." Through the facility's main gate, Steele could see additional federal vehicles arriving, DEA agents, FBI forensics teams, and the kind of coordinated law enforcement response that suggested Morrison's criminal enterprise had been under surveillance longer than anyone had realized. "What about Sarah and Emma?" Steele asked. "Mrs. Morrison is providing a detailed statement to federal prosecutors. Her testimony, combined with the evidence on the USB drive and Morrison's recorded confession, gives us a racketeering case that extends far beyond one corrupt detective. Walsh's expression was professionally neutral, but Steele detected approval in her voice. As for Emma Morrison, Child Protective Services has already moved for emergency custody removal. She's with her aunt in Portland as of this morning. Relief washed through Steele like a physical presence. Emma was safe, Sarah was free, and Morrison's criminal network was being dismantled by people with the resources and authority to do the job properly. And the cartel. Miguel Santos died during the federal raid on the Ramirez compound early this morning. 3 other cartel members in custody, along with enough evidence to prosecute the entire Southwest distribution network. Walsh stood, brushing dust from her pants. Morrison's information proved very valuable once we understood the scope of his involvement. Steele looked around the mining facility, seeing it differently now that the immediate danger had passed. The abandoned equipment and industrial decay that had provided perfect concealment for their confrontation now seemed like artifacts of a simpler time, when American industry built things that lasted and corruption was an aberration rather than a system. Tommy appeared from the facility's main building, escorted by 2 federal agents but not restrained. His grin was fierce and satisfied as he approached Steele's position. "How's it looking, brother?" "Mixed bag," Steele replied. "Federal prosecutors are calling us material witnesses in a major racketeering case. Could mean witness protection, could mean federal cooperation, could mean a lot of courtroom time over the next 2 years. Better than the alternative," Steele had to agree. 24 hours ago, they'd been facing a corrupt police detective with cartel connections and unlimited resources for violence. Now Morrison was dead. The cartel network was being systematically destroyed by federal law enforcement, and Sarah's daughter was safe with family. Who would protect her? Marshal Walsh returned with a thick folder and the kind of serious expression that suggested Steele's legal situation was about to become complicated. "Mr. Rodriguez, you're being offered federal cooperation in exchange for your testimony against remaining cartel associates." Walsh opened the folder, revealing legal documents that would reshape Steele's immediate future. "Your actions over the past 48 hours resulted in the exposure of a major criminal conspiracy, the rescue of a federal witness, and the elimination of corrupt law enforcement officials who had compromised multiple ongoing investigations. What's the catch?" "No catch. But cooperation means relocating until the trials are complete, limited contact with your former associates, and significant changes to your lifestyle." Walsh's voice was matter-of-fact. "The Hells Angels chapter you belong to is also under federal investigation for potential connections to the Ramirez distribution network." Steele thought about the brotherhood he'd served for 23 years. Now facing federal scrutiny because of his choices. But he also thought about Emma Morrison, safe with her aunt and free from a father who'd been willing to murder to protect his criminal enterprise. What happens to Sarah? Mrs. Morrison will testify before a federal grand jury, then enter witness protection until the trials conclude. After that, she's free to rebuild her life wherever she chooses. Walsh closed the folder. Her daughter will remain in protective custody with family until it's safe for them to reunite. Steele looked at the federal badge Walsh wore, representing legitimate law enforcement, finally cleaning up the corruption that had made Morrison's crimes possible. 6 months later, Steele turned the key in the ignition of his new motorcycle and felt the familiar rumble of American steel and engineering beneath him. The bike was a Harley-Davidson Softail, purchased with money he'd earned working construction in Phoenix under the Federal Witness Protection Program. Not the same as his old ride, but close enough to remind him of who he'd been before Detective Ray Morrison had tried to murder his wife on a quiet Saturday morning. The construction job had been good for Steele, honest work that left him tired in body but clear in conscience. Building houses for families, creating something permanent and valuable, using his hands for construction rather than destruction. It wasn't the brotherhood he'd known for 23 years. But it was meaningful work that connected him to the principles his father had tried to teach him, about serving something larger than himself. Sarah Chen had testified before 3 separate federal grand juries, her courage under cross-examination helping to convict 17 cartel associates and 4 corrupt law enforcement officers. The trials had taken 8 months, but the prosecutions were thorough, and the convictions were solid. Morrison's criminal network was dismantled completely, and the federal investigation had expanded to include corruption in 3 other police departments. Steele's phone buzzed with a text message from Maria Santos. "Coffee at the usual place? Have news about a mutual friend." The usual place was a small cafe in downtown Phoenix, where Steele had been meeting Maria once a month to coordinate his volunteer work with her organization. Federal witness protection had given him a new identity and a new life. But it hadn't changed his fundamental conviction that people who couldn't protect themselves deserved help from those who could. 20 minutes later, Steele walked into the cafe and found Maria already seated at their regular table, her expression carrying news that could be good or complicated. Maria Santos had become a valuable friend over the past 6 months, someone who understood the cost of fighting systems that protected abusers while failing their victims. "Sarah's coming to Phoenix," Maria said without preamble. "Trials are over, witness protection is ending, and she wants to start fresh somewhere that doesn't have memories attached to every street corner." Steele felt a complex mixture of emotions at that news. Sarah Chen had been the catalyst for everything that had happened. The end of his brotherhood, the exposure of massive corruption, the deaths of Morrison and multiple cartel associates. But she'd also been the reason he'd discovered what he was truly capable of when innocent people needed protection. How is she? Stronger than anyone expected. The federal prosecutors offered her a job with the Justice Department, helping other women navigate the legal system when their abusers have institutional connections. Maria's smile was proud and satisfied. Turns out surviving what Morrison put her through gave her exactly the experience needed to help other survivors. And Emma, happy, healthy, and excited about starting 3rd grade in a new school, where nobody knows her father was a corrupt cop who tried to murder her mother. Maria's expression grew more serious. "Sarah wants to see you, Steele, to say thank you properly for what you risked to help her." Steele considered that possibility. Sarah Chen represented both the best and worst decision he'd ever made. Helping her had cost him his brotherhood and his identity, but it had also saved 2 lives and exposed corruption that had resulted in multiple deaths. Seeing her again would bring back memories of everything that had led to this moment. Tell her I'm glad she's safe. Glad Emma's thriving, and glad the system finally worked the way it's supposed to work. Steele finished his coffee and stood to leave. But also tell her that the man who helped her that morning doesn't exist anymore. Marcus Rodriguez died in a mining facility 6 months ago, along with Ray Morrison. Maria reached across the table and touched Steele's arm gently. The man sitting here right now helped 3 other women escape from dangerous situations over the past 6 months. Built houses for families who needed homes, volunteered at shelters for abused women, and found ways to serve something larger than himself. Her voice carried conviction that surprised him. Maybe Marcus Rodriguez evolved instead of dying. Steele thought about that possibility as he walked back to his motorcycle. The Federal Witness Protection Program had given him a new name, new identity, and new life. But the principles that had driven him to help Sarah, Chen, the conviction that innocent people deserved protection regardless of the personal cost, those principles hadn't changed. The construction crew would be expecting him at 7 tomorrow morning, ready to frame another house for another family, starting fresh in a place without dangerous memories. It was honest work, meaningful work, and work that connected him to the man his father had hoped he would become. Steele climbed onto his motorcycle and headed home through the Arizona sunset, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes losing Everything you thought you wanted was the only way to discover what you actually needed, the driver's license in Sarah. Jen's wallet bore her maiden name and a Phoenix address, small symbols of the freedom she'd fought so hard to reclaim. She sat in the passenger seat of Steele's pickup truck as they drove toward the elementary school, where Emma would be starting 3rd grade, both of them nervous about this reunion in ways that had nothing to do with physical danger. "She's grown 3 inches since I last saw her," Sarah said, studying recent photos on her phone. "Maria's sister says Emma talks about becoming a police officer when she grows up, but the good kind, who actually protects people." Steele smiled at that. Emma Morrison had inherited her mother's strength and her determination to make the world safer for people who couldn't protect themselves. It seemed fitting that a child who'd survived her father's corruption would want to restore integrity to law enforcement. "What did you tell her about me?" "The truth. That you're the man who helped her mother when no one else would, and that you're someone she can trust completely." Sarah's voice carried the calm confidence of someone who'd learned to recognize trustworthy people through bitter experience. "She wants to meet you." They pulled into the school parking lot just as classes were ending for the day. Steele watched children streaming out of the building, all backpacks and animated conversations, and felt the weight of what their actions 6 months ago had accomplished. Emma Morrison would grow up free from the fear that had shaped her early childhood, able to trust that the adults in her life were committed to her safety rather than their own criminal enterprises. "There she is," Sarah said, pointing to a girl with dark hair and Sarah's intelligent eyes, who was scanning the parking lot with careful attention. Emma Morrison had learned early to be aware of her surroundings, but now that awareness served safety rather than survival. Steele stayed in the truck while Sarah walked toward her daughter, giving them space for a reunion that had been delayed by months of federal trials and witness protection protocols. He watched Emma's face light up with pure joy as she recognized her mother, then saw the careful way Sarah knelt to Emma's level for a conversation that probably involved explanations about their new life in Phoenix. After a few minutes, Sarah gestured towards Steele's truck and Emma nodded seriously. The little girl walked over with the kind of measured confidence that reminded Steele of her mother's courage under pressure. "You're the man who helped my mum," Emma said through the passenger window, studying Steele's face with the directness that children brought to important conversations. "I am. Your mom's very brave, and she did most of the helping herself. She says you used to be in a motorcycle club, but you gave that up to keep us safe." Steele considered how to respond to that. Emma was 7 years old enough to understand that adults sometimes made sacrifices for people they cared about, but too young for the full complexity of what had happened between him and Morrison. "Sometimes grown-ups have to choose between what's easy and what's right," he said finally. "Your mom made me understand that doing what's right is always worth whatever it costs." Emma studied his face for a moment longer, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a drawing she'd made in art class. It showed 3 figures standing together, a woman, a man, and a little girl, with a house in the background and sunshine filling the sky. "This is for you," she said, handing him the drawing through the window. "To say thank you for helping my mum come home." Steele accepted the drawing, with hands that weren't quite steady, understanding that this simple gesture represented everything he'd fought for over the past 6 months. Emma Morrison was safe, healthy, and hopeful about the future. Sarah had reclaimed her life and found meaningful work helping other women escape dangerous situations. And Steele had discovered that losing his old identity had given him the opportunity to become someone his father would have been proud to know. "Thank you, Emma. This means more to me than you'll ever know." That evening, Steele hung Emma's drawing on his apartment refrigerator, next to photos from construction jobs and volunteer work with Maria's organization. The artwork reminded him that sometimes the most important victories were measured not in criminal convictions or federal prosecutions, but in the simple fact that a 7-year-old girl could draw pictures of sunshine and safety instead of fear and violence. His phone rang, and Steele recognized Tommy's voice immediately. His former road captain had survived the federal investigation of the Hells Angels chapter, and their friendship had quietly resumed once Steele's witness protection obligations were complete. "Brother, got a situation here. Woman showed up at the clubhouse, says her ex-husband's been threatening to kill her and take their kids. Police won't help because the guy's connected somehow." Tommy's voice carried familiar urgency. "Bulldog says it's not club business, but some things matter more than club business," Steele finished. "What do you need?" As Tommy outlined the situation, Steele looked at Emma's drawing and understood that his new road would always lead toward people who needed protection from those who would harm them. Some journeys never really ended. They just found new paths toward the same destination.